Apparently, Alex O'Connor's favorite argument for God is the ontological argument.
There are so many. I think there's even an argument for the existence of God that can be made just from the number of arguments for the existence of God. The fact that there's an argument from beauty, an argument from contingency, from ontology, from maths, from like any way you look, there's an argument for God. So you can always make an argument for God's existence from the sheer number of arguments for God's existence.
Haven't heard that before. That's great.
That's a pretty weak argument for God's existence. It's a good argument for the idea that lots of people want God to exist or want to convince people that God exists. But given the quality of each argument, the fact that there are a lot of them isn't very compelling. Also, the fact that so many arguments are presented makes it seem like theists themselves are a bit defensive and insecure in their beliefs.
Depends what you mean. My favorite for a while has been the so-called ontological argument, where you sort of think God into existence. I think it's quite fun. You can just do it from an armchair. It doesn't require any observation. I mean, that's quite fun. I mean, it goes back to St. Anselm, who is praying. He's writing down this prayer. And he sort of challenges you in a way. He says, can you conceive of the greatest conceivable being? Just think of the greatest conceivable being.
Mm.
So whatever qualities it has, power, goodness, all this kind of stuff, just turn it up to the maximal conceivable amount, right?
Mm.
If I were to maximize these qualities to the greatest conceivable degree, I couldn't conceive of an entity that has all of those qualities combined. For example, I couldn't conceive of an entity that is both all good and all powerful because those two qualities contradict one another. An all good entity would be one that only ever does good things in every conceivable scenario. That would mean that it would be inconceivable for such a being to do anything bad, and thus it would not be all powerful. It wouldn't have the power to do bad things. The greatest conceivable being also wouldn't be the timeless, spaceless entity that William Lane Craig claims God is, because a timeless, spaceless entity is also not conceivable.
You got it in your head? You're picturing, you're thinking of just the greatest conceivable being? Okay, does that being exist in reality? Here's the problem. If you say no, then you're not doing what I asked you to.
Yeah, the reason a lot of people think this is a strong argument is because it forces people to think of the greatest conceivable being as existing, because its proponents insist that existence is greater than non-existence.
Because you can conceive of
But isn't that a limitation of the mind? I mean,
yeah, but
we talked about this in terms of the Baha'i faith, about God being the unknowable essence, and that men have created a God in their minds that they falsely worship, right?
But we're not talking about God.
The argument implies that God has to be conceivable. It's totally inapplicable to the descriptions of God that say that God is beyond human comprehension.
We're just talking about the greatest conceivable being, which by definition you can conceive of. You just go to the ends of your conceivability.
Okay.
The greatest being of which I can conceive is the universe, or the multiverse as the case may be. It's literally bigger than everything else. Every power that exists within the multiverse. Everything good that exists within the multiverse.
Now, Anselm's like, you can conceive of that being existing just in your mind, or existing in your mind and also in reality.
If existence is a great-making property, then something that exists both in one's mind and in reality would be greater than something that only exists in reality but is inconceivable and therefore can't fit into your mind.
So if the thing you're picturing is something like a really powerful, really loving, really, great being, it kind of approximates what people call God. You can imagine that either just existing in your mind as you're thinking about it, or maybe it exists in your mind, but it also exists in reality. But if it exists in reality and the mind, then it's greater. It's got more existence, right? And so when you're just asked to conceive of the greatest conceivable being, if you're not automatically thinking of a being that exists in reality, then you're not thinking of the greatest conceivable being.
My biggest problem with this argument is that it only ties the concept of God to the concept of existence. That's not the same thing as tying it to existence itself. The problem with every version of the ontological argument is that to say that something exists is to say that it's not just fictional, that it's more than just a concept. But this argument tries to prove that something is more than just a concept by using nothing but concepts. How is that supposed to work?
But because you can think of the greatest conceivable being by definition, you're automatically thinking of a being that exists in reality. Therefore, this God must exist in reality. It's my favorite because it sounds a bit stupid.
Stevens, that. You're not buying it.
It sounds more than a bit stupid.
We can't.
He said, what about the greatest conceivable unicorn? This is the greatest objection to Anselm, when people say, oh, well, you're just thinking God into existence, because what about the greatest conceivable unicorn?
Or what about a realicorn, which is a unicorn that is actually real by definition? If you say the realicorn isn't real, then you're contradicting yourself. Anything can be made real if you just add realness to its definition.
Like, okay, but what you've just done is limited your scope. Because I asked you to imagine the one on the mug.
Unicorn right here.
I was like, okay, imagine the greatest conceivable thing, right? And I'm like, that thing must exist in reality. Okay, well, the greatest conceivable unicorn has limited our scope, right? There could be a unicorn that you're imagining that's greater than another unicorn you're imagining, right? Okay, we can make that unicorn a better unicorn, like giving it a sharper horn and a more beautiful mane or whatever. But like, even if we imagine the greatest conceivable unicorn, we can make that unicorn a greater conceivable thing by giving it even more qualities. Well, let's make that unicorn all powerful,
telepathic, and
it doesn't make it a better unicorn, but it makes it a better thing.
I think this objection sidesteps the main problem with the argument, which is that defining something in such a way as to force you to think of it as existing doesn't really prove something's existence.
Right? And so, like, the question is, does the unicorn existing in reality make it a better unicorn than just existing in the mind?
If existing in reality is better than just existing in the mind, then yeah, it does make it a better unicorn. I think Alex's point, though, might be that it doesn't make it a more unicorny unicorn. It doesn't enhance its unicornness. However, a more general being, which exists in reality, is a more being-y being, because actually existing does enhance a being's beingness. Existence is not inherent to the concept of a unicorn, but it is inherent to the concept of a being.
And it seems like kind of not really, because the things that make a unicorn great are things like a nice mane, a pointy horn and stuff. And the one in your head has all of those things. It has all of the things that are the great-making properties of a unicorn.
If existence is a great-making property, why wouldn't it be a great-making property for everything?
It's all in the one that you're thinking of. And if it existed in reality, I don't know if that is a better great-making property of a unicorn, right?
I don't think there's an objective standard by which we can say that it's a great-making property of anything, but if we're talking about a general being, then actually existing does make something a more being-y being. Maybe to avoid this semantic confusion, the argument should, instead of asking us to imagine the greatest conceivable being, ask us to imagine the most being-y being. That way you avoid the question of whether existence is a great-making property or for what it is a great-making property. This, however, would expose how facile the argument is, because it would be reduced to saying that God is the most existingest existence that you can imagine existing.
Whereas, if you're asking about the greatest conceivable thing, then you're maximizing all the properties, not just the unicorn-making properties, but all properties a thing can have, including levels of existence.
Well, no, you're not, because the thing still has to be conceivable, and combining all maximized properties would lead to contradictions.
It's a bit much. Like it's why I sort of hesitate to bring it up, because it is my favorite. But it's a bit difficult
But let's continue on that, because what comes to my mind, and we discussed this when I was on your pod, is I tried to be an atheist.
Yeah.
And I really spent a good couple years, at least, just really trying to exist in a world that inherently didn't have any meaning to it, or didn't have any kind of transcendent power beyond what could be kind of determined through scientific diagnosis.
As an atheist, I'm not committed at all to the idea that there is nothing beyond the reach of scientific diagnosis. Science can only give us information that's useful for predicting experience and observation. Things that are beyond science are beyond usefulness, and thus I can't bring myself to care about them.
And it just didn't add up to me. It didn't make sense to me. It didn't work for me. It just didn't add up. I mean, I guess, what's the famous watch on the beach analogy of God?
Yeah, the teleological argument.
Yes, that if you're walking along a beach and you see a perfectly functioning Swiss watch, you're not going to go, oh, wow, all of these elements just fell together here on this beach and created this beautiful, perfect watch that's incredibly... You'd be like, there's someone made the watch.
Yeah, but that's only because I am aware of the existence of things like manufacturing and machinery, etc. If I were totally unfamiliar with such processes, I would see no reason at all to make any such inference. I just don't feel this intuition that everything complex must have been deliberately made. If I did, I don't see why that same intuition wouldn't extend to a god. If you contemplate nature and get this hunch that some conscious being deliberately made it, why don't you get that intuition when you contemplate God?
When I deeply imagine a three-dimensional universe made of, energy, but, matter and atoms and dark matter, and there was a big bang, and there's galaxies, and that it just happened, it just existed, it just sprang into existence, and that there are, physical laws, and then somehow out of that chemistry became biology and creatures were created, and there was paramecium, and then there was, little amoebas and whatnot, and then they evolved into creatures, and somehow we have a creature and we have a large consciousness, and we're having this conversation over this podcast. When I think of the totality of that, without any kind of greater power or energy, it doesn't make sense to me.
So when you think of this greater power or energy that has the intelligence and ability to create all this stuff, how does it make sense to you that it just exists on its own without itself having a creator?
Not just on a cognitive level. It just doesn't make sense in my heart. It doesn't make sense in my life experience. When I picture all of that with some kind of greater unknowable energy beyond time and space coursing through it, it makes total sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes no sense at all to me. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.